The evening had settled into that perfect autumn temperature when Thomas Wilson noticed his rescue dog Orion acting stranger than usual. The German Shepherd mix had been pacing at the back door for the past hour, whining and shooting glances between Thomas and the dense woods behind their rural Montana home. "What's got you so worked up, buddy?" Thomas asked, scratching behind Orion's ears. The dog's response was to grab Thomas's sleeve gently between his teeth and tug, something he'd never done before. Thomas had learned to trust Orion's instincts. 3 years ago, the dog had led firefighters to a trapped hiker during a forest fire, earning him local hero status. Since then, Thomas had come to believe that Orion possessed an almost supernatural sense for those in need. All right, Thomas conceded, grabbing his flashlight and jacket. "Show me what's so important." The moment he opened the door, Orion bolted into the darkness, his black and tan coat disappearing between the trees. Thomas followed, grateful for the full moon that helped illuminate the familiar path. The crisp leaves crunched beneath his boots as he tracked Orion's excited barks deeper into the forest. After about 10 minutes of walking, Thomas found Orion sitting beside what appeared to be a shimming patch of air, like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. But this was different, it had a faint bluish tinge and seemed to pulse with an inner light. "Orion, get back," Thomas called out, but the dog didn't move. Instead, he barked once, then used his nose to push against the strange distortion. The air rippled, and suddenly Thomas was staring at two figures huddled against a fallen log. His first thought was that they were hypothermic hikers, but as he raised his flashlight, the beam revealed something that defied explanation. The woman, if she could be called that, had silvery skin that seemed to shimmer with its own inner luminescence. Her hair was a deep purple that moved like liquid silk, and her eyes were large, almond-shaped, and entirely silver with no visible pupils. Beside her was a child, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, who shared her mother's otherworldly features but had hair the color of a sunset. Thomas stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The woman moved slightly, revealing a nasty gash along her side that seemed to leak a phosphorescent blue fluid. Orion, showing no fear whatsoever, lay down beside the child, who immediately buried her face in his fur. The dog looked back at Thomas with an expression that clearly said, "Well? Are you going to help them or not?" "Please," the woman spoke, her voice carrying an ethereal quality that seemed to echo in Thomas's mind as much as his ears. "We mean no harm. We're refugees, my daughter and I, we had nowhere else to go." Thomas had always considered himself a rational man. At 42, he'd built a successful career as a freelance software developer specifically so he could live away from the chaos of cities. He liked order, logic, and explanations. But looking at Orion's protective stance over the child, Thomas felt something shift in his worldview. "You're hurt," he said simply, taking a step forward. "I have a first aid kit at home. Can you walk?" The woman's silver eyes widened in surprise. You're not afraid?" Thomas almost laughed. "Oh, I'm terrified. But my dog seems to trust you, and he's never been wrong about people before. I'm Thomas Wilson, and that's Orion." "I am Lyra," the woman said, wincing as she tried to stand. "And this is my daughter, Nova." The child peeked out from behind Orion's protective bulk, her eyes, swirling with colors like an aurora borealis, meeting Thomas's. "Your dog is kind," she said in perfect English, though her voice carried the same ethereal quality as her mother's. "He found us when we crashed and helped hide us." Thomas glanced at Orion, who wagged his tail as if to say, "See? I told you it was important." "How long have you been out here?" Thomas asked, shrugging off his jacket to wrap it around Lyra's shoulders. "3 of your Earth days," Lyra replied, accepting his help to stand. "Our cloaking device was damaged in the landing, and we couldn't risk being seen. But we were running out of options." She swayed slightly, and Thomas caught her arm to steady her. "Well, you can't stay out here," Thomas said firmly. Whatever brought you here, whatever you're running from, that can wait until you're both warm and safe. Nova stood up, still keeping one hand buried in Orion's fur. Mother, he feels truthful. Like the dog. Lyra nodded slowly. Yes, I sense it too. Thank you, Thomas Wilson. We are, in your debt. As they made their way back to his house, Thomas tried to process the magnitude of what was happening. He had just invited aliens, actual extraterrestrial refugees, into his home. His ordinary life had just become extraordinary, and somehow, his rescue dog had orchestrated the whole thing. Orion trotted alongside Nova, occasionally looking back at Thomas with what could only be described as a smug expression. The dog had always brought home strays, injured birds, lost cats, even a baby deer once. But this time, he'd really outdone himself. The journey back was slow due to Lyra's injury, giving Thomas time to think. He lived alone, his nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and he had plenty of space. He could help them, at least until they recovered and figured out their next move. It was crazy, probably dangerous, and definitely illegal, but looking at Nova's innocent face and Lyra's determined struggle to protect her child, he knew he couldn't do anything else. As they approached his house, the porch light casting a warm glow into the darkness, Thomas realized that Orion had done more than find someone who needed help, he'd found someone who needed a home. And maybe, though he wasn't ready to admit it yet, the dog had sensed that Thomas needed them too. Welcome to Earth, Thomas said softly as he opened his door. Let's get you both taken care of. Orion barked once in approval and guided Nova inside, his tail wagging with the satisfaction of a job well done. After all, bringing home strays wasn't just what he did, it was who he was. And this time, he'd brought home the most extraordinary strays of all. The first week of harboring interstellar refugees proved more challenging than Thomas had anticipated. His initial attempts to treat Lyra's wound with conventional first aid supplies were unsuccessful, her alien physiology rejected traditional bandages, and the mysterious blue fluid continued to seep from her injury. It was Nova who finally solved the problem. Mother needs starlight, she explained one evening, while absently braiding small sections of Orion's fur. The dog lay perfectly still, clearly enjoying the attention. Our bodies process stellar energy for healing. Thomas had immediately rearranged his home office into a makeshift bedroom for Lyra, positioning her bed directly beneath the skylight. Within 2 days of sleeping under the stars, her wound began to close, the ethereal blue glow dimming as her silvery skin knitted itself back together. Orion had appointed himself Nova's personal guardian, following the alien child everywhere she went. He seemed particularly attuned to her emotional state, pressing close when she missed home and playing elaborate games of hide-and-seek when she needed cheering up. Thomas often found himself wondering if the dog somehow understood more about their visitors than he let on. "Your world is very solid," Lyra commented one morning, watching Thomas prepare breakfast. She had taken to wearing some of his old clothes, though they hung oddly on her slender frame. "Our cities float, you see. Buildings drift like clouds, connecting through bridges of light." Thomas nearly dropped the spatula he was holding. "That sounds beautiful," he managed, trying to imagine such a place. "Do you miss it?" A shadow passed across her silver eyes. "What I miss no longer exists. The regime saw to that." Nova looked up from where she sat on the floor with Orion, her aurora-like eyes dimming slightly. The dog immediately pressed his nose against her cheek, and she managed a small smile. "Tell Thomas about the sky gardens, Mother. Those were my favorite." Over plates of scrambled eggs, which both aliens approached with fascinating curiosity, Lyra described their homeworld. Thomas learned about floating islands of luminescent flowers, creatures that danced between stars, and cities that sang as solar winds passed through their crystalline spires. But with each story came hints of darkness, mentions of the regime, and their systematic destruction of everything beautiful in their quest for power. Thomas began to understand why Lyra had fled with her daughter, though many questions remained unanswered. The greatest challenge was keeping their presence secret. Thomas's property was isolated, but he still had to make supply runs and maintain appearances. He told his few neighbors he was hosting distant relatives, and kept Nova and Lyra hidden whenever anyone visited. Orion proved invaluable in this regard. The dog seemed to have a sixth sense for approaching vehicles, always alerting them well before anyone arrived. He would lead Nova to their designated hiding spot in the basement, while Lyra activated what remained of their cloaking technology. "He's remarkably intelligent," Lyra observed one afternoon, watching Orion teach Nova how to play fetch in the backyard. The alien child threw the ball with telekinetic ability, making it loop and spiral through the air while the dog leaped and twisted with joyful determination. "He's always been special," Thomas agreed, trying not to stare as Nova made the ball hover and spin. "But he's outdone himself with you too. I've never seen him so purposeful." Lyra turned those mesmerizing silver eyes toward him. "Our people have a belief about creatures like him. We call them soul guides, beings who help lost spirits find their way home." "But you're not home," Thomas pointed out. "You're stranded on an alien planet, hiding from whatever it is you're hiding from." "Home isn't always a place," Lyra said softly. "Sometimes it's the people, or beings, who make you feel safe." Their conversation was interrupted by Nova's delighted laughter. Orion had managed to catch the floating ball in a spectacular leap, and was now doing a victory lap around the yard with his prize while Nova chased him. As the weeks passed, Thomas found himself adapting to his new reality with surprising ease. He learned that Nova could communicate telepathically with Orion, which explained their incredible bond. He discovered that both aliens could manipulate light, creating beautiful displays in the evening that made his living room feel like the inside of a nebula. Lyra began helping him with his software work, her understanding of mathematics and programming far beyond anything on Earth. She could see patterns in code that he had never imagined, and together they completed projects in hours that would have taken him days. But it was the quiet moments that truly transformed his home. Evening walks in the woods with Orion leading the way, Nova pointing out constellations and sharing stories about distant stars she'd visited. Morning conversations with Lyra over coffee, which she had grown to love, learning about each other's cultures and lives. One night, as Thomas watched Nova fall asleep curled up against Orion on the couch, he realized his house had become more than just a hiding place for two refugees. Somehow, without him noticing, it had become a home for all of them. "She hasn't had nightmares in days," Lyra whispered, carefully draping a blanket over her daughter and the dog. "Back home, she would wake up screaming every night, afraid the regime would find us." "Orion would never let anything happen to her," Thomas said with certainty. "To either of you." Lyra's hair shimmed with iridescent colors in the dim light. "Neither would you, Thomas Wilson. You've given us more than shelter, you've given us hope." As if agreeing, Orion opened one eye and thumped his tail against the couch, then went back to his protective watch over Nova. Outside, the stars twinkled in the Montana sky, and Thomas wondered if somewhere up there, the people hunting Lyra and Nova were still searching. If they were, they'd have to get through him and Orion first. Some things, he was learning, were worth any risk to protect. The first sign of trouble came on an otherwise peaceful Tuesday morning. Thomas was working on his laptop while Lyra helped Nova practice controlling her growing abilities. The alien child had graduated from levitating tennis balls to manipulating multiple objects simultaneously, all under Orion's watchful supervision. Suddenly, every electronic device in the house went haywire. Thomas's laptop screen flickered and died, the lights pulsed erratically, and the TV turned itself on and off repeatedly. Orion's ears perked up seconds before a low-flying helicopter passed overhead. "Government survey," Thomas said, checking his phone once it started working again. "They're mapping electromagnetic anomalies in the area." He looked meaningfully at Nova, who was biting her lip, her aurora-like eyes dimmed with worry. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Sometimes when I practice, it affects things differently here than at home." Lyra moved to comfort her daughter, but Orion was faster. The German Shepherd mix pressed against Nova's side, offering silent support. The child buried her fingers in his fur, drawing strength from his presence. "We need to be more careful," Lyra said, her silvery skin dimming with concern. "If they detect our energy signatures." Thomas nodded grimly. "We'll move your practice sessions to the basement. The concrete walls should help contain any electromagnetic disturbances." But it wasn't just Nova's powers they had to worry about. Over the next few weeks, black SUVs began appearing on the rural roads near Thomas's property. Men in suits conducted interviews with local residents, asking about unusual lights in the sky or unexplained phenomena. Orion proved invaluable during these close calls. His acute senses warned them long before any visitors arrived, giving Lyra and Nova time to hide. The dog also developed a clever way of creating distractions when government agents got too close to the house, leading them on wild chases through the woods after non-existent wildlife. One particularly close call came when Dr. Rachel Palmer, a government physicist, arrived unannounced. Thomas was in the backyard with Nova and Orion when the dog suddenly went rigid, staring intently toward the front of the house. "Someone's coming," Nova said, her voice echoing in Thomas's mind, a new ability she'd recently discovered. Without waiting for instructions, she grabbed Orion's collar and they silently disappeared into the basement through the exterior entrance. Thomas barely had time to get inside before he heard a car pulling up. Through the window, he saw a woman in a crisp suit stepping out of a government vehicle, carrying what looked like sophisticated scanning equipment. "Mr. Wilson," she called out, approaching the front door. "I'm Dr. Palmer from the Department of Energy. We've detected some unusual energy signatures in this area. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Thomas opened the door, projecting calm despite his racing heart. "Of course not," he said, letting her in while silently praying that Lyra's cloaking technology was working. Dr. Palmer's equipment beeped steadily as she walked through his house. "Have you noticed any unusual phenomena lately? Electronics acting strange, unexplained lights, that sort of thing?" "Can't say that I have," Thomas replied, watching nervously as she approached the basement door. "It's pretty quiet out here." Suddenly, a chorus of frantic barking erupted from outside. Thomas recognized Orion's voice, along with what sounded like several other dogs. Dr. Palmer jumped, her equipment forgotten as she rushed to the window. In the front yard, Orion was running in circles, playing with what appeared to be 3 other German shepherds. Thomas's jaw dropped. He knew they weren't real, that Nova must be creating illusions, but they looked perfectly solid. "Your dog seems to have company," Dr. Palmer observed, smiling. "The neighbor's dogs," Thomas lied smoothly. "They come over sometimes to play. Orion loves the company." The physicist watched the dogs for a moment longer, then checked her equipment. The readings had stabilized, showing nothing unusual. "Well, everything seems normal here," she said, though she sounded disappointed. "If you notice anything strange, please call this number." After she left, Thomas waited until Orion gave the all-clear signal before rushing to the basement. He found Nova exhausted but proud, while Orion stood guard over her like a protective shadow. "That was quick thinking with the dog illusions," Thomas said, helping her up. Nova managed a tired smile. "Orion helped. He showed me exactly what they should look like and how they should move. We practiced it last week, just in case." Thomas looked at the dog in surprise. "You two practiced emergency illusions?" Lyra emerged from her hiding spot, her hair swirling with worried colors. "Orion seems to understand more about protecting us than we realized. He's been helping Nova develop her abilities in ways that could help us hide." The dog wagged his tail once, then gently headbutted Nova's hand, encouraging her to sit down and rest. Thomas watched their interaction with growing amazement. Just how intelligent was Orion, and how much did he understand about their situation? That evening, as they discussed the close call over dinner, Thomas realized they needed a better plan. The government was getting too close, and Nova's powers were growing stronger every day. It would become increasingly difficult to hide their presence. Maybe we should consider moving, he suggested reluctantly. I have a cabin in Idaho that's even more remote than this place. But before Lyra could respond, Orion started growling, a deep, serious sound they'd never heard from him before. Nova's eyes went wide with fear. Mother, she whispered, I can feel them. They're coming. Lyra's skin paled to an almost translucent silver. Not the government, she said softly. The regime. They've found us. Thomas looked at Orion, who stood alert and ready, his loyal heart clearly prepared for whatever came next. Whatever was coming, they would face it together, a human, two aliens, and one extraordinary dog, bound together by trust and something that felt remarkably like love. Thomas had always wondered what first contact with alien life would be like. He'd never imagined it would involve standing in his living room at midnight, watching Orion bare his teeth at mysterious lights descending from the sky while an alien child clutched his hand. We have 19 minutes before they breach the atmosphere, Lyra announced, her silver skin pulsing with nervous energy. The regime's tracking systems will need time to adjust to Earth's magnetic field. Then we have 18 minutes to get you both out of here, Thomas said firmly, already moving toward the basement where they'd stored the remains of Lyra's ship. But she caught his arm, her touch sending a slight electrical tingle through his skin. Thomas, she said softly, if we run, they'll follow. And this time, they'll destroy everything in their path to find us. Your world isn't ready for that kind of attention. Nova pressed closer to Orion, who hadn't moved from his protective stance by the window. Mother, show him, she whispered. Show him the truth. Lyra hesitated, then raised her hands. The air between them shimmered, and suddenly Thomas was seeing images, memories, playing out like a holographic movie. He saw a magnificent floating city, its crystal spires reaching toward 3 moons. He saw Lyra, dressed in ornate robes, addressing a council of beings similar to herself. I was first speaker of the High Council, Lyra's voice echoed in his mind as the images continued. When the regime began their coup, they expected me to surrender our people's ancient rights of self-governance. Instead, The image shifted to show Lyra stealing something, a small crystalline object that pulsed with incredible energy. The heart of harmony, Nova supplied, her aurora eyes fixed on the memory. Mother took it so they couldn't use its power to control everyone's minds. The images faded, leaving Thomas blinking in the dim light of his living room. You're not just refugees, he said slowly. You're revolutionaries. The regime has been hunting us across 12 solar systems, Lyra confirmed. Not just to punish us, but to recover the heart. With it, they could extend their control beyond our world to everywhere. A low rumble shook the house, and Orion's growl deepened. Through the windows, Thomas could see multiple craft breaking through the clouds, their designs unlike anything human engineers could have conceived. We have to make a choice, Lyra continued, her voice tight with emotion. We can try to run, but they'll follow us to the next world, and the next. Or we can stand and fight, Thomas finished. He looked at Nova, who was watching him with those incredible, swirling eyes. In the 3 months since Orion had brought them home, she'd become like a daughter to him. And Lyra, well, those feelings were too new and precious to examine under pressure. Orion suddenly barked, a sharp sound that drew everyone's attention. The dog moved to the center of the room and sat, looking expectantly at Nova. The alien child's eyes widened. He has an idea, she said, excitement creeping into her voice. Mother, remember how you said Earth animals perceive energy differently? Orion thinks he can help us use the heart. Lyra's hair rippled with surprise. That's impossible. The heart of harmony can only be controlled by those trained in the ancient traditions. But Nova was already moving, pulling a small crystal from the hidden pocket in her clothes where she'd been keeping it safe. As she held it out, the crystal began to glow, responding to her touch. Orion stood and pressed his nose against it. The effect was immediate and astonishing. The crystal's light spread through the room in waves of color that reminded Thomas of Nova's eyes. Where it touched him, he felt an overwhelming sense of peace and connection. It's responding to his pure intent, Lyra whispered in awe. Your dog, Thomas, he doesn't just guide lost souls. He protects them. That's why he found us. That's why he's been helping Nova develop her abilities. He knew we'd need. Another rumble, closer this time. Through their strange new connection, Thomas could feel the hostile intent of the ships above. But he could feel something else too, the unwavering loyalty of Orion, the fierce love Nova had for all of them, and Lyra's growing hope. If we're going to do this, Thomas said, reaching for Lyra's hand, we do it together. This is your home now, if you want it. And I protect my family. Tears like liquid starlight slid down Lyra's cheeks as she gripped his hand. Nova stepped between them, holding the heart of harmony while Orion pressed against her legs, his presence steady and sure. Outside, the first of the regime's ships was landing. Inside, a most unusual family prepared to make their stand, a human software developer, an alien revolutionary, a child of two worlds, and one extraordinary dog who had somehow known, from the first moment he found them in the woods, that they would all need each other. The heart of harmony pulsed brighter, drawing power from their connection. Through their linked minds, Thomas heard Orion's voice for the first time, not in words, but in feelings of protection, love, and absolute certainty that together, they would prevail. Ready? Lyra asked, her free hand resting on Orion's head. Thomas smiled, feeling Nova's determination and Orion's steadfast courage flowing through their bond. Ready. Let's show the regime what happens when they mess with our pack. The regime's soldiers were not prepared for what they found when they breached Thomas Wilson's front door. They had expected to find a frightened former council speaker and her daughter, perhaps hiding behind primitive Earth defenses. Instead, they encountered something unprecedented in all their conquests across the galaxies. The heart of harmony, suspended between Nova's small hands, pulsed with a light that seemed to draw power from the very air itself. Orion stood before the child, his form seeming to shift between that of an Earth dog and something far more ancient and powerful. Through their connected minds, Thomas understood what Lyra suddenly realized: Orion wasn't just helping them use the heart. He was a catalyst, awakening its true purpose. Stand down, Lyra commanded, her voice carrying the authority of her former position. Her silver skin blazed with internal light, her hair writhing like living flame. Your war ends here. The regime commander, a tall figure in sleek armor, laughed. You're outnumbered, first speaker. Surrender the heart, and perhaps we'll make your execution quick. But Thomas felt no fear. Through their shared connection, he could sense Orion's strategy unfolding. For months, the dog had been preparing for this moment, teaching Nova to control her powers, strengthening their bonds, creating a foundation of trust and love that now fueled the heart's ancient magic. Nova closed her eyes, her aurora-like irises glowing through her eyelids. Orion says we're ready, Mother. What happened next would later be reported as a mysterious aurora borealis visible across half the continent. The heart of harmony exploded with light, but instead of the destructive force the regime had hoped to harness, it released waves of pure consciousness. Through their mental link, Thomas experienced fragments of Orion's true nature, an ancient guardian spirit, drawn to Earth eons ago, waiting for the moment when the universe would need his particular gift. The regime's soldiers dropped their weapons, overwhelmed by the sudden awareness of their connection to every living thing around them. The heart wasn't a weapon at all, it was a key, designed to unlock the innate empathy that the regime had spent generations trying to suppress. "This is what they feared," Lyra breathed, watching as the soldiers sank to their knees. Not the heart's power to control, but its power to awaken. Through the open door, Thomas could see more ships landing, but these were different, bearing the symbols of the resistance. The regime's control was breaking across multiple worlds as the heart's influence spread through their neural networks. Orion barked once, and the light changed, condensing into a shimmering field around their property. Nova giggled. "He's creating a safe space for the transition team to land. Orion says we're going to have guests." Within hours, their rural Montana home became the site of Earth's first official extraterrestrial diplomatic mission. Resistance leaders, now free from the regime's control, worked quickly to contain the situation. Thomas watched in amazement as Lyra effortlessly stepped back into her role as a leader, but with a difference. Now she spoke not just for her people, but for Earth as well. "We need to proceed carefully," she explained to the gathered alien diplomats in Thomas's living room, while Orion maintained his vigilant watch from Nova's side. "Earth isn't ready for full disclosure, but they deserve a voice in galactic affairs. We'll need to establish gradual contact protocols. Through approved channels only," Thomas added, surprising himself with how natural it felt to participate in interstellar politics. "We can set up a technological exchange program, but it has to be managed responsibly." The next few weeks were a blur of activity. The government teams that had been investigating the area were quietly redirected, their memories adjusted to protect Earth's gradual introduction to galactic society. Lyra's people began the long process of rebuilding their democracy, with the heart of harmony safely restored to its true purpose as a tool for fostering understanding rather than control. Through it all, their unusual family grew stronger. Thomas's home became a bridge between worlds, with Orion continuing his self-appointed role as guardian and guide. The dog seemed particularly pleased when the alien diplomats installed special shielding that would allow Nova to practice her abilities without affecting Earth's electronics. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching three moons rise over Montana, a temporary gift from Lyra's people that would be explained to humans as an atmospheric phenomenon, Thomas felt a profound sense of contentment. "Did you know?" he asked Orion, who lay with his head in Nova's lap while she practiced creating constellation illusions. "When you found them in the woods, did you know everything that would happen?" The dog's tail thumped against the porch boards, and through their lingering mental connection, Thomas caught impressions of destiny, choice, and the simple joy of bringing lost souls together. Lyra, her silver skin glowing softly in the moonlight, leaned against Thomas's shoulder. "In all my years of studying Earth, I never understood why your people formed such strong bonds with dogs. Now I think perhaps they've been preparing you, teaching you about unconditional love and trust, making you ready for the day when you'd need to extend that love to the stars." Nova looked up from her light weaving, her eyes reflecting the triple moonlight. "Can we keep him forever?" she asked, scratching Orion's ears. "Even when we have to travel to other worlds?" "My dear," Thomas said, pulling her close while Orion wagged his tail in approval, "I have a feeling Orion would follow you across the universe. That's what family does." As if to confirm this, Orion stood and shook himself, then turned to face the stars. His howl echoed across the valley, an Earth dog's ancient song, now carrying a new message to the cosmos. "We are here," it seemed to say. "We are together. We are home." The heart of harmony, safely stored in its new chamber beneath the house, pulsed once in response. Above them, the three moons shone down on a most unusual family, a human who had opened his heart to the extraordinary, an alien leader who had found strength in exile, a child who bridged two worlds, and a dog who had known all along that sometimes the strays you bring home are exactly the ones the universe needs you to find. And somewhere in the vast reaches of space, other guardians like Orion stirred, ready to help guide the next lost souls home. After all, the universe was wide, and there were so many more stories waiting to be told.